We are recording. We're on Coffee and Tea and Charley, class 11, I think.
Next to last.
Yeah, the next to last, the
Penultimate.
penultimate. Take it away,
Penultimate,
Jake.
yeah.
All right. Well, good morning to you West Coasters.
Good morning.
So we are on page 160 in my book, and we are about to visit relatives in California and Texas. So without any further ado, my scratchy throat hopefully will hold out. Much earlier, I spoke of the changes at state lines, changes in highway English and prose forms on the signs, changes in permitted speeds. The state's rights guaranteed under the Constitution seem to be passionately and gleefully exercised. California searches vehicles for vegetables and fruits which might carry pernicious insects and diseases, and regulations of these are enforced with almost religious intensity. Some years ago, I knew a gay and inventive family from Idaho. Planning to visit relatives in California, they took a truckload of potatoes to sell along the way to help pay expenses. They had disposed of over half their cargo when they were stopped at the California line and their potatoes were refused entrance. They were not financially able to abandon their potatoes, so they cheerfully set up camp right on the state line where they ate potatoes, sold potatoes, and bartered potatoes. At the end of 2 weeks, the truck was empty. Then they went through the inspector's station in good standing and continued on their way. The separateness of the states, which has been bitterly called balkanization, creates many problems. Rarely do two states have the same gasoline tax, and these taxes largely support the building and maintenance of highways. The enormous interstate trucks make use of the roads and by their very weight and speed increase the maintenance costs. Thus, the states have weighing stations for trucks where the loads are assessed and taxed. And if there is a differential in gasoline tax, the tanks are measured and the tax applied. The signs say all trucks stop. Being a truck, I stopped, only to be waved on over the scales. They were not looking for such as I. But sometimes I stopped and talked to the inspectors when they were not too busy. And this brings me to the subject of state police. Like most Americans, I am no lover of cops and the consistent investigation of city forces for bribery, brutality, and a long and picturesque list of malfeasances is not designed to reassure me. However, my hostility does not extend to the state troopers now maintained in most parts of the country. By the simple expedient of recruiting intelligent and educated men, paying them adequately, and setting them beyond political coercion, many states have succeeded in creating elite corps of men, secure in their dignity and proud of their service. Eventually, our cities may find it necessary to reorganize their police on the pattern of the state police, but this will never happen while political organizations retain the slightest power to reward or to punish. And here again, Steinbeck is very prophetic. Across the Colorado River from Needles, the dark and jagged ramparts of Arizona stood up against the sky, and behind them, the huge tilted plain rising toward the backbone of the continent again. I know this way so well from many crossings: Kingman, Ash Fork, Flagstaff, with its mountain peak behind it, then Winslow, Holbrook, Sanders, downhill and up again, and then Arizona passed. What is that? It's an Eagles song, right? Standing at the corner of Winslow, Arizona. The towns were a little larger and more brightly lighted than I remembered them, the motels bigger and more luxurious. I crossed into New Mexico, rushed past Gallup in the night, and camped on the Continental Divide. And much more spectacular it is here than in the north. The night was very cold and dry, and the stars were cut glass. I drove into a little canyon out of the wind and parked by a mound of broken bottles, whiskey and gin bottles, thousands of them, and I don't know why they were there. And I sat in the seat and faced what I had concealed from myself. I was driving myself, pounding out the miles because I was no longer hearing or seeing. I had passed my limit of taking in, or like a man who goes on stuffing in food after he is filled, I felt helpless to assimilate what was fed in through my eyes. Each hill looked like the one just passed. I have felt this way in the Prado in Madrid after looking at 100 paintings, the stuffed and helpless inability to see more. So once again, he's done this about 4 or 5 times throughout the book where he gets to a point and he's questioning his trip again, or what he's doing on the trip. And at this point in New Mexico, after making it all the way across the country and seeing his old homes, he's now falling back into the state of kind of a little bit of the state of a desolation and thinking that he really doesn't have the drive to do this anymore. My students always say, well, this is a very odd thing that he pulls into like the mountains in New Mexico and camps in a canyon, and there's thousands of whiskey and gin bottles just sitting there. I always found that odd too, but he doesn't really explain it anymore. This would be a time to find a sheltered place beside a stream to rest and refurbish. Charley in the dark seat beside me mentioned a difficulty with a little moaning sigh. I had even forgotten him. I let him out and he staggered to the hill of broken bottles, sniffed at them, and took another way. The night air was very cold, shivery cold, so that I lighted the cabin and turned up the gas to warm the air. The cabin was not neat. My bed was unmade and breakfast dishes lay desolate in the sink. I sat on the bed and stared into gray dreariness. Why had I thought I could learn anything about the land? For the last hundreds of miles, I had avoided people. Even at necessary stops for gasoline, I had answered in monosyllables and retained no picture. My eye and brain had welched on me. I was fooling myself that this was important or even instructive. There was a ready remedy, of course. I reached out the whiskey bottle without getting up, poured half a tumbler, smelled it, and poured it back in the bottle. No remedy was there. Charley had not returned. I opened the door and whistled him and got no response. That shook me out of it. I grabbed my searchlight and turned its spearing beam up the canyon. The light flashed on 2 eyes about 50 yards away. I ran up the trail and found him staring into space, just as I had been. What's the matter, Charley? Aren't you well? His tail slowly waved his replies. Oh yes, quite well, I guess. Why didn't you come in when I whistled? I didn't hear you whistle. Hey, has anybody ever seen the movie Up?
Yes.
With Doug?
Yeah. Doug.
Have you ever seen the 5 and 6 minute shorts that they made of Doug and his new master?
No.
They made like 5 6 minute shorts just of him and Doug. They sell the big blimpy thing and they move into a house. Oh my God. It's so hilarious. It's just like, it's just Doug talking to it. It's awesome. Anyway, you should see it if you can. Why didn't you come when I whistled, Charley? I didn't hear you whistle. What are you staring at? I don't know. Nothing, I guess. Well, don't you want your dinner? I'm not really hungry, but I'll go through the motions. Back in the cabin, he flopped down on the floor and put his chin down on his paws. Come on up on the bed, Charley. Let's be miserable together. He complied, but without enthusiasm, and I rifled my fingers in his top knot and behind his ear the way he likes it. How's that? He shifted his head. A little more to the left. There, that's the place. We'd be lousy explorers. A few days out and we get the mully grubs. The first white man through here, I think he was named Narvaez, and I'm under the impression his little joint took 6 years. Move over. I'll look it up. Nope, it was 8 years. 1528 to 1536, and Narvaez himself didn't make it this far. 4 of his men did, though. I wonder if they ever got the mully grubs. We're soft, Charley. Maybe it's time for a little gallantry. When's your birthday? I don't know. Maybe it's like horses, the 1st of January. Think it might be today, Charley? Who knows? I could make you a cake. Have to be hot cake mix because that's what I have. Plenty of syrup and a candle on top. Charley watched the operation with some interest. His silly tale made delicate conversation. Anybody saw you make a birthday cake for a dog that he don't even know when this birthday is would think that you were nuts. If you can't manage any better grammar than that with your tale, maybe it's a good thing you can't talk. Steinbeck's going a little nuts here. But I love that he leaves it in the book. It turned out pretty well. 4 layers of hot cakes with maple syrup between and a stub of a miner's candle on top. I drank to Charley's health and straight whiskey as he ate and licked up the syrup. And then we both felt better. But there was Narvaez party 8 years. There were men in those days. Charley licked the syrup from his whiskers. What makes you so moony? It's because I've stopped seeing, Charley. When that happens, you think you'll never see again. He stood up and stretched himself. First fore and then aft. Let's take a stroll up the hill, he suggested. Maybe you've started again. We inspected the pile of broken whiskey bottles and then continued up the trail. The dry, frozen air came out of us in plumes of steam. Some fairly large animal went leaping up the broken stone hill, or maybe a small animal in a big little avalanche. What does your nose say that was? Nothing I recognize. Kind of a musky smell. Nothing I'm going to chase either. So dark was the night that it was prickled with fiery dots. My light brought an answering flash up the steep rocky bank. I climbed up, slipping and floundering, lost the echoed light and found it again. A good little new split stone with a piece of mica in it. Not a fortune, but a good thing to have. I put it in my pockets and we went to bed. All right, so now we are beginning the final stage of the book, which is called Part 4. When I started this narrative, I knew that sooner or later I would have to go to Texas, and I dreaded it. I could have bypassed Texas about as easily as a space traveler can avoid the Milky Way. It sticks its big old panhandle up north and it slops and slouches along the Rio Grande. Once you're in Texas, it seems to take forever to get out, and some people never make it. Let me say in the beginning that even if I wanted to avoid Texas, I could not. For I am wived in Texas and mother-in-lawed and uncled and aunted and cousined within an inch of my life. Staying away from Texas geographically is no help whatever, for Texas moves through our house in New York, our fishing cottage at Sag Harbor, and when we had a flat in Paris, Texas was there too. It permeates the world to a ridiculous degree. Once in Florence, on seeing a lovely little Italian princess, I said to her father, but she doesn't look Italian. It may seem strange, but she looks like an American Indian. To which her father replied, why shouldn't she? Her grandfather married a Cherokee in Texas. Writers facing the problem of Texas find themselves floundering in generalities, and I am no exception. Texas is a state of mind. Texas is an obsession. Above all, Texas is a nation in every sense of the word. And there's an opening covey of generalities. A Texan outside of Texas is a foreigner. My wife refers to herself as the Texan that got away, but that is only partly true. She has virtually no accent until she talks to a Texan, when she instantly reverts. You would not have to scratch deep to find her origin. She says such words as yes, air, hair, guess with 2 syllables, yayas, ayer, hayer, gayers. And sometimes in a weary moment, the word ink becomes ank. Our daughter, after a stretch in Austin, was visiting New York friends, and she said, do you have a pin? Certainly, dear, said her host. Do you want a straight pin or a safety pin? Aunt, a fountain pen, she said. I've studied the Texas problem from many angles and for many years, and of course, one of my truths is inevitably canceled by another. Outside their state, I think Texans are a little frightened and very tender in their feelings, and these qualities cause boasting, arrogance, and noisy complacency. the outlets of shy children. At home, Texans are none of these things. The ones I know are gracious, friendly, generous, and quiet. In New York, we hear them so often bring up their treasured uniqueness. Texas is the only state that came into the Union by treaty. It retains the right to secede at will, and we have heard them threaten to secede so often that I formed an enthusiastic organization, the American Friends for Texas Secession. This stops the subject cold. They want to be able to secede, but they don't want anyone to want them to secede. Has anybody ever lived in Texas? Anybody ever lived in Texas at any point in time? No.
No, but
I have.
this secession thing is, I mean, we're hearing about it now. This must have been going on forever. I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're like the Quebec of America. Quebec is always threatening Canada too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of my family, my nephews and their wives and 8 and 7 greats all live in Austin. So I know Texas well. You get that?
Yeah.
Well, I did spend some time in Texas, and I have to say I really liked the people there. I found them to be some of the friendliest people ever. And the sky was just absolutely enormous. So it does have a very big sky. I was also in Austin and around Austin, which tends to be, a very friendly place. Like most passionate. Oh, go ahead.
I thought Big Sky was in Montana.
Oh no, Texas too. Montana has big skies, but I tell you, I've never seen a bigger sky than in Texas. It's like the ground is only, I don't know, you feel like you're kind of in the sky most of the time. It's a very nice feeling. Of course, I might have been doing other things at that time. No, I think it was pretty good. Like most passionate nations, Texas has its own private history based on, but not limited by, facts. The tradition of the tough and versatile frontiersman is true, but not exclusive. Raise your hand if you think Ted Cruz fits that description. No, just kidding. It is for the few to know that in the great old days of Virginia, that's where I am right now, there were 3 punishments for high crimes: death, exile to Texas, and imprisonment, in that order. And some of the deportees must now have descendants. So Texas was kind of like the English's Australia. It was a penal colony. Again, the glorious defense to the death of the Alamo against the hordes of Santa Anna is a fact. The brave bands of Texans did indeed wrest their liberty from Mexico, and freedom, liberty are holy words. One must go to contemporary observers in Europe for a non-Texan opinion as to the nature of the tyranny that raised need for revolt. Outside observers say the pressure was twofold. The Texans, they say, didn't want to pay taxes. And second, Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, and Texas, being part of Mexico, was required to free its slaves. Of course, there were other causes of revolt, but these 2 are spectacular to a European and are rarely mentioned here. That's very true. I have said that Texas is a state of mind, but I think it is more than that. It is a mystique, closely approximating a religion. And this is true to the extent that people either passionately love Texas or passionately hate it. And as in other religions, few people dare to inspect it for fear of losing their bearings in mystery and paradox. Any observations of mine can be quickly canceled by opinion or by counter-observation, but I think there will be little quarrel with my feeling that Texas is one thing. For all its enormous range of space, climate, and physical appearance, and for all the internal squabbles, contentions, and strivings, Texas has a tight cohesiveness, perhaps stronger than any other section of America. Rich, poor, panhandle, Gulf, city, country, Texas is the obsession, the proper study, and the passionate possession of all Texans. Some years ago, Edna Ferber wrote a book about a very tiny group of very rich Texans. Her description was accurate so far as my knowledge extends, but the emphasis was one of disparagement. And instantly the book was attacked by Texans of all groups, classes, and possessions, because to attack one Texan is to draw fire from all Texans. The Texas joke, on the other hand, is a revered institution, beloved and in many cases originating. in Texas. The tradition of the frontier cattleman is as tenderly nurtured in Texas as is the hint of Norman blood in England. And while it is true that many families are descended from contract colonists, not unlike the present-day braqueros, all hold to the dream of the longhorn steer and the unfenced horizon. When a man makes his fortune in oil or government contracts and chemicals or wholesale groceries, his first act is to buy a ranch, the largest he can afford, and to run some cattle. And then he hires Billy Crystal and his friends to drive them for him. A candidate for public office who does not own a ranch is said to have little chance of election. Does Ted Cruz own a ranch? We have to think about that. The tradition of the land is deep fixed in the Texas psyche. Businessmen wear heeled boots that never feel a stirrup, and men of great wealth who have houses in Paris and regularly shoot grouse in Scotland refer to themselves as little old country boys. It would be easy to make sport of their attitude if one did not know that in this way they try to keep their association with the strength and simplicity of the land. Instinctively, they feel that this is the source not only of wealth, but of energy. And the energy of Texans is boundless and explosive. The successful man with his traditional ranch, at least in my experience, is no absentee owner. He works at it, oversees his herd, and adds to it. The energy in a climate so hot as to be staggering is also staggering. And the tradition of hard work is maintained whatever the fortune or lack of it. So again, when Steinbeck gets into something like truckers, like mobile homes, like Texas, he really goes at it. And he's in one of those periods right now. The power of an attitude is amazing. Among other tendencies to be noted, Texas is a military nation. The armed forces of the United States are loaded with Texans and often dominated by Texans. Even the dearly loved spectacular sports are run almost like military operations. Nowhere are there larger bands or more marching organizations with corps of costumed girls whirling glittering batons. Sectional football games have the glory and the despair of war. And when a Texas team takes the field against a foreign state, it is an army with banners. If I keep coming back to the energy of Texas, it is because I am so aware of it. It seems to me like that thrust of dynamism which caused and permitted whole peoples to migrate and to conquer in earlier ages. The landmass of Texas is rich in recoverable spoil. If this had not been so, I believe the relentless energy of Texans would have moved out and conquered new lands. This conviction is somewhat borne out in the restless movement of Texas capital. But now, so far, the conquest has been by purchase rather than by warfare. The oil deserts of the Near East, the opening lands of South America, have felt the thrust. Then there are new islands of capital conquest, factories in the Middle West, food processing plants, tool and dye works, lumber and pulp. Even publishing houses have been added to the legitimate 20th century Texas spoil. There is no moral in these observations, nor any warning. Energy must have an outlet and will seek one. In all ages, rich, energetic, and successful nations, when they have carved their place in the world, have felt hunger for art, for culture, even for learning and beauty. The Texas cities shoot upward and outward. The colleges are heavy with gifts and endowments. Theaters and symphony orchestras sprout overnight. In any huge and boisterous surge of energy and enthusiasm, there must be errors and miscalculations, even breach of judgment and taste. And there is always the non-productive brotherhood of critics to disparage and to satirize, to view with horror and contempt. My own interest is attracted to the fact that these things are done at all. There will doubtless be thousands of ribald failures, but in the world's history, artists have always been drawn where they are welcome and well treated. And by its nature and its size, Texas invites generalities, and the generalities usually end up as paradox. The little old country boy at a symphony, the booted and blue-jeaned ranchman in Neiman Marcus buying Chinese jades. Politically, Texas continues its paradox. Traditionally and nostalgically, it is Old South Democrat, but this does not prevent its voting conservative Republican in national elections while electing liberals to city and county posts. My opening statement still holds. Everything in Texas is likely to be canceled by something else. Steinbeck had no understanding of the word cancel as it would be now. Most areas in the world may be placed in latitude and longitude, described chemically in their earth, sky, and water, rooted and fuzzed over with identified flora, and peopled with known fauna, and there is an end to it. Then there are others where fable, myth, preconception, love, longing, or prejudice step in, and so distort a cool, clear appraisal that a kind of high-colored, magical confusion takes permanent hold. Greece is such an area, and those parts of England where King Arthur walked. One quality of such places, as I am trying to define, is that a very large part of them is personal and subjective, and surely Texas is such a place. I have moved over a great part of Texas, and I know that within its borders I have seen just about as many kinds of country, contour, climate, and conformation as there are in the world, save only the Arctic, and a good north wind can even bring the icy breath down. The stern horizon fenced plains of the Panhandle are foreign to the little wooded hills and sweet streams in the Davis Mountains. The rich citrus orchards of the Rio Grande Valley do not relate to the sagebrush grazing of South Texas. The hot and humid air of the Gulf Coast has no likeness to the cool crystal in the northwest of the Panhandle, and Austin, on its hills among the bordered lakes, might be across the world from Dallas. What I am trying to say is that there is no physical or geographical unity in Texas. Its unity lies in the mind. And this is not only in Texans. The word Texas becomes a symbol to everyone in the world. There's no question that this Texas of the mind fable is often synthetic, sometimes untruthful, and frequently romantic, but that in no way diminishes its strength as a symbol. It took him a while to get there, but this is a very interesting part because he's really looking at place, and especially places that mix myth and reality, of which he's saying Greece, King Arthur's England, and Texas are three of the big ones. But now he's getting into glacial studies, which was not a thing back in the day. It only originated really glacial studies in the 90s. So this is kind of the foreground of the area that I actually study besides world religions. The foregoing investigation into the nature of the idea of Texas is put down as a prelude to my journeying across Texas with Charley in Rocinante. It soon became apparent that this stretch had to be different from the rest of the trip. In the first place, I knew the countryside. And in the second, I had friends and relatives by marriage. And such a situation makes objectivity practically impossible. For I know no place where hospitality is practiced so fervently as in Texas. But before that most pleasant and sometimes exhausting human trait took hold, I had 3 days of namelessness in a beautiful motor hotel in the middle of Amarillo. A passing car on a gravel road had thrown up pebbles and broken out the large front window of Rocinante, and it had to be replaced. But more important, Charley had been taken with his old ailment again, and this time he was in bad trouble and great pain. I remembered the poor, incompetent veterinary in the Northwest who did not know and did not care, and I remembered how Charley had looked at him with pained wonder and contempt. In Amarillo, the doctor I summoned turned out to be a young man. He drove up in a medium-priced convertible. He leaned over Charley. "What's his problem?" he asked. I explained Charley's difficulty. Then the young vet's hands went down and moved over hips and distended abdomen, trained and knowing hands. Charley sighed a great sigh, and his tail wagged slowly up from the floor and down again. Charley put himself in this man's care, completely confident. I've seen this instant rapport before, and it is good to see. The strong fingers probed and investigated, and then the vet straightened up. "It can happen to any little old boy," he said. "Is it what I think it is?" "Yep, prostatitis." "Can you treat it?" "Sure. I'll have to relax him first, and then I can give him medication for it. Can you leave him for maybe 4 days?" "Whether I can or not, I will." He lifted Charley in his arms and carried him out and laid him in the front seat of the convertible, and the tufted tail twittered against the leather. He was content and confident, and so was I, and that is how I happened to stay around Amarillo for a while. To complete the episode, I picked up Charley 4 days later, completely well. The doctor gave me pills to give at intervals while traveling so that the ailment never came back. There's absolutely nothing to take the place of a good man. I do not intend to dwell long on Texas. Since the death of Hollywood, the Lone Star State has taken its place at the top for being interviewed, inspected, and discussed. But no account of Texas would be complete without a Texas orgy showing men of great wealth squandering their millions on tasteless and impassioned exhibitionism. My wife had come from New York to join me, and we were invited to a Texas ranch for Thanksgiving. It is owned by a friend who sometimes comes to New York, where we give him an orgy. My college students were getting pretty excited at this point, but it is not that type of orgy. It is a beautiful ranch, rich in water and trees and grazing land. Everywhere, bulldozers had pushed up earth dams to hold back the water, making a series of life-giving lakes down the center of the ranch. On well-grassed flats, the blooded Herefords grazed, only looking up as we drove by in a cloud of dust. I don't know how big the ranch is, and I didn't ask my host. The house, a one-story brick structure, stood in a grove of cottonwoods on a little eminence over a pool made by a dammed-up spring. The dark surface of the water was disturbed by trout that had been planted there. The house was comfortable, had 3 bedrooms, each room with a bath, both tub and shower. The living room, paneled in stained pine, served also as a dining room with a fireplace at one end and a glass-fronted gun case against the side. Through the open kitchen door, the staff could be seen, a large, dark lady and a giggleful girl. Our host met us and helped carry our bags in. The orgy began at once. We had a bath, and on emerging were given scotch and soda, which we drank thirstily. After that, we inspected the barn across the way, the kennels in which there were 3 pointers, one of them not feeling so well. Then to the corral, where the daughter of the house was working on the training of a quarter horse, an animal of parts named Specklebottom. After that, we inspected 2 new dams with water building slowly behind them, and at several drinking stations communed with a small herd of recently purchased cattle. This violence exhausted us, and we went back to the house for a short nap. We awakened from this to find neighboring friends arriving. They brought a large pot of chili con carne made from a family recipe, which was the best I have ever tasted. Now other rich people began to arrive, concealing their status in blue jeans and riding boots. Drinks were passed and a gay conversation ensued having to do with hunting, riding, and cattle breeding, with many bursts of laughter. I reclined on a window seat and in the gathering dusk watched the wild turkeys come in to roost in the cottonwood trees. They fly up clumsily and distribute themselves, and then suddenly they blend with the tree and disappear. At least 30 of them came in to roost. As the darkness came, the window became a mirror in which I could watch my host and his guests without their knowledge. They sat about the little paneled room, some in rocking chairs and 3 of the ladies on a couch. And the subtlety of their ostentation drew my attention. One of the ladies was making a sweater, while another worked a puzzle, tapping her teeth with the eraser of a yellow pencil. The men talked casually of grass and water, of so-and-so who had bought a new champion bull in England and flown it home. They were dressed in jeans of that light blue, lighter and a little frayed at the seams that can be achieved only by 100 washings. But this studied detail did not stop there. Boots were scuffed on the inside and salted with horse sweat, and the heels run over. The open collars of the men's shirts showed dark red lines of sunburn on their throats, and one guest had gone to the trouble and expense of breaking his forefinger, which was splinted and covered with laced leather cut from a glove. My host went to the extreme of serving his guests from a bar, which consisted of a tub of ice, quart bottles of soda, 2 bottles of whiskey, and a case of pop. The smell of money was everywhere. The daughter of the house, for example, sat on the floor cleaning a .22 rifle, telling a sophisticated and ribald story of how Specklebottom, her stallion, had leaped a 5-bar corral gate and visited a mayor in the next county. She thought she had property rights in the foal, Specklebottom's bloodline being what it was. The scene verified what we have all heard about fabulous Texas millionaires. I was reminded of a time in Pacific Grove when I was painting the inside of a cottage my father had built there before I was born. My hired helper worked beside me, and neither of us being expert, we were well splattered. Suddenly, we found ourselves out of paint. I said, "Neil, run up to Holman's and get a half-gallon of paint and a quart of thinner." "I'll have to clean up and change my clothes," he said. "Nuts, go as you are." "I can't do it." "Why not? I would." Then he said a wise and memorable thing. "You got to be awful rich to dress as bad as you do," he said. And this isn't funny. It's true. And it was true at the orgy. How unthinkably rich these Texans must be to live as simply as they were. That's an interesting point. Does that mean people think that I'm rich? I don't know. I took a walk with my wife around the trout pool and over against the hill. The air was chill and the wind blowing from the north had winter in it. We listened to frogs, 4 frogs, but they had shacked up for the winter. But we heard a coyote howl upwind and we heard a cow bawling for her late weaned bairn. The pointers came to the wire mesh of the kennel, wriggling like happy snakes and sneezing with enthusiasm. And even the sickly one came out of his house and fleered at us. Then we stood in the high entrance of the great barn and smelled at the sweetness of alfalfa and the bready odor of rolled barley. At the corral, the stock horses snorted at us and rubbed their heads against the bars, and Specklebottom took a kick at a gelded friend just to keep in practice. Owls were flying this night, shrieking to start their prey, and a nighthawk made soft rhythmic whoops in the distance. I wished that able Baker Charley dog could have been with us. He would have admired this night, but he was resting under sedatives in Amarillo curing his prostatitis. The sharp north wind clashed the naked branches of the cottonwoods. It seemed to me that winter, which had been on my tail during the whole trip, had finally caught up with me. Somewhere in our, or at least my recent zoologic past, hibernation must have been a fact of being. Else why does cold night air make me so sleepy? It does, and it did, and we went into the house where the ghosts had already retired, and we went to bed. I awakened early. I had seen 2 trout rods leaning against the screen outside our room. I went down the grassed hill, slipping in the frost to the edge of the dark pool. A fly was ready, fastened on the line, a black net, a little frayed but still hairy enough. And as it touched the surface of the pool, the water boiled and churned. I brought in a 10-inch rainbow trout and skidded him up on the grass and knocked him on the head. I cast 4 times and had 4 trout. I cleaned them and threw the innards to their friends. In the kitchen, the cook gave me coffee and I sat in an alcove while she dipped my fish in cornmeal and fried them crisp in bacon fat and served them to me under a coverlet of bacon that crumbled in my mouth. It was a long time since I had eaten trout like that, 5 minutes from water to pan. You take him in your fingers delicately by head and tail and nibble him from off his backbone. And finally, you eat the tail, crisp as a potato chip. Coffee has a special taste of a frosty morning, and the 3rd cup is as good as the first. I would have lingered in the kitchen discussing nothing with the staff, but she cleared me out because she had to stuff 2 turkeys for the Thanksgiving orgy. In the mid-morning sunshine, we went quail hunting, I with my old and shiny 12-bore with a dented barrel, which I carried in Rocinante. That gun was no great shakes when I bought it secondhand 15 years ago, and it has never gotten any better. But I suppose it is as good as I am. If I can hit them, the gun will pull them down. But before we started, I looked with a certain longing through the glass door at a Luigi Franchi 12-gauge double with a purdy lock so beautiful that I was filled with covetousness. The carving on the steel had the pearly gleam of a Damascus blade, while the stock flowed into lock and lock into barrels as though they had grown that way from a magic planted seed. I'm sure that if my host had seen my envy, he would have loaned me the beauty, but I didn't ask. Suppose I tripped and fell or dropped it or knocked its lovely tubes against a rock. Nope, it would be like carrying the crown jewels through a minefield. My old beat-up gun is no bargain, but at least anything that can happen to it has, and there's no worrying. For a week, our host had noted where the coveys were gathering. We spread out and moved through brush and thicket, down into water, out and up, while the spring steel pointers worked ahead of us, and a fat old pointer named Duchess with flame in her eyes outworked them all and us too. We found quail tracks in the dust, quail tracks in the sand and mud of stream beds, bits of quail feather fluff and the dry tips of the sage. We walked for miles, slowly, guns up and ready to throw shot at a drumming flight, and we never saw a quail. The dogs never saw or smelled a quail. We told stories and some lies about previous quail hunts, but it did no good. The quail had gone, really gone. I am only a reasonable quail shot, but the men with me were excellent. The dogs were professional, keen, hard, and hardworking, but no quail. But there's one nice thing about hunting. Even with no birds, you'd rather go than not. So it's interesting in that in going to Texas, he writes about things that happen in Texas. And if you like Texas, you find that interesting. My host thought my heart was breaking. He said, look, you take that little 2222 of yours this afternoon and you go shoot yourself a wild turkey. How many are there? I asked. Well, 2 years ago, I planted 30. I think there are about 80 now. I counted 30 in the band that flew up near the house last night. Well, there's 2 other bands, he said. I really didn't want a turkey. What should I do with it in Rocinante? I said, wait a year. When they top 100 birds, I'll come down and hunt with you. We came back to the house and showered and shaved. And because it was Thanksgiving, we put on white shirts and jackets and ties. And the orgy came off on schedule at 2 o'clock. I'll skip through the details quickly in order not to shock the readers. And also, I see no reason to hold these people up to scorn. After 2 good drinks of whiskey, the 2 brown and glazed turkeys were brought in, carved by our host and served by us. We said grace and afterward drank a toast all around and ate ourselves into a proper insensibility. Then, like decadent Romans at Petronius's board, we took a walk and retired for the necessary and inevitable nap. And that was my Thanksgiving orgy in Texas. Of course, I don't think they do it every day. They couldn't, and somewhat the same thing happens when they visit us in New York. Of course, they want to see shows and go to nightclubs, and at the end of a few days of this, they say, we just don't see how you can live like this, to which we reply, we don't, and when you go home, we won't. And now I feel better for having exposed to the light of scrutiny the decadent practices of the rich Texans I know. But I don't for one moment think they eat chili con carne or roast turkey every day. All right, we are at 177. We got about 10 minutes left. We'll do a few more pages. When I laid the ground plan of my journey, there were definite questions to which I wanted matching answers. It didn't seem to me that they were impossible questions. I suppose they could all be lumped into the single question. What are Americans like today? Wow. What if I asked you that question today? What are Americans like? It's a very difficult answer. In Europe, it is a popular sport to describe what the Americans are like. Everyone seems to know, and we are equally happy in this game. How many times have I not heard one of my fellow countrymen after a 3-week tour of Europe describe with certainty the nature of the French, the British, the Italians, the Germans, and above all, the Russians? Traveling about, I early learned the difference between an American and the Americans. They are so far apart that they might be opposites. Often when a European has described the Americans with hostility and scorn, he has turned to me and said, of course, I don't mean you. I am speaking of those others. It boils down to this: the Americans, the British, are that faceless clot you don't know, but a Frenchman or an Italian is your acquaintance and possibly your friend. He has none of the qualities your ignorance causes you to hate. I had always considered this a kind of semantic deadfall, but moving about in my own country, I am not at all sure that it is so. Americans, as I saw them and talked to them, were indeed individuals, each one different from the others. But gradually I began to feel that the Americans exist, that they really do have generalized characteristics, regardless of their states, their social and financial status, their education, their religions, and their political convictions. But if there is indeed an American image built of truth rather than reflecting either hostility or wishful thinking, what is this image? What does an American look like? What does it do? If the same song, the same joke, the same style sweeps through all parts of the country at once, it must be that all Americans are alike in something. The fact that the same joke, the same style, has no effect in France or England or Italy makes this contention valid. However, the internet changed all that. But the more I inspected this American image, the less sure I became of what it was or is. It appeared to me increasingly paradoxical, and it has been my experience that when paradox crops up too often for comfort, it means that certain factors are missing in the equation. Now, I had moved through a galaxy of states, each with its own character, and through clouds and myriads of people, and ahead of me lay an area, the South, that I dreaded to see, and yet knew I must see and hear. I am not drawn to pain and violence. I never gaze at accidents unless I can help or attend street fights for kicks. I faced the South with dread. Here I knew were pain and confusion and all the manic results of bewilderment and fear. And the South being a limb of the nation, its pain spreads out to all of America. That's a really beautiful point. And the South being a limb of the nation, its pain spreads out to all of America. I knew, as everyone knows, the true but incomplete statement of the problem, that an original sin of the fathers was being visited on the children of succeeding generations. I have many Southern friends, both Negro and white, many of them superb minds and characters, and often, when not the problem but the mere suggestion of the Negro-white subject has come up, I have seen and felt them go into a room of experience into which I cannot enter. Perhaps I, more than most people from the so-called North, am kept out of real and emotional understanding of the agony, not because I, a white, have no experience with Negroes, but because of the nature of my experience. In Salinas in California, where I was born and grew and went to school, gathering the impressions that formed me, there was only one Negro family. The name was Cooper, and the father and mother were there when I was born, but they had 3 sons, one a little older than I, one my age, and one a year younger, so that in grade school and high school, there was always a Cooper in the grade ahead, one in my class, and one in the class below. In a word, I was bracketed with Coopers. The father, universally called Mr. Cooper, ran a little trucking business, ran it well, and made a good living. His wife was a warm and friendly woman who was good for a piece of gingerbread anytime we wanted to put the hustle on her. If there was any color prejudice in Salinas, I never heard or felt a breath of it. The Coopers were respected, and their self-respect was in no way forced. Ulysses, the oldest, was one of the best pole vaulters our town ever developed, a tall, quiet boy. I remember the lean grace of his movements in a tracksuit, and I remember envying his smooth and perfect timing. He died in his 3rd year in high school, and I was one of his pallbearers, and I think I was guilty of the sin of pride at being chosen. The second son, Ignatius, my classmate, was not my favorite. I discover now because he was far and away the best student. In arithmetic and later in mathematics, he topped our grades, and in Latin, he not only was a better student, but he didn't cheat. And who can like a classmate like that? The youngest Cooper, the baby, was all smiles. It's odd that I do not remember his first name. He was a musician from the start, and when I last saw him, he was deep in composition, which seemed, to my partially instructed ear, bold and original and good. But beyond this giftedness, the Cooper boys were my friends. Now, these were the only Negroes I knew or had contact with in the days of my flypaper childhood, and you can see how little I was prepared for the great world. When I heard, for example, that Negroes were an inferior race, I thought the authority had been misinformed. When I heard that Negroes were dirty, I remembered Mrs. Cooper's shining kitchen. Lazy? The drone and clop of Mr. Cooper's horse-drawn dray in the street outside used to awaken us in the dawn. Dishonest? Mr. Cooper was one of the very few Salinians who never let a debt cross the 15th of the month. I realize now that there was something else about the Coopers that set them apart from other Negroes I have seen and met since. Because they were not hurt or insulted, they were not defensive or combative. Because their dignity was intact, they had no need to be overbearing, and because the Cooper boys had never heard that they were inferior, their minds could grow to their true limits. That was my Negro experience until I was well grown, perhaps too far grown, to reform the inflexible habits of childhood. Oh, I have seen plenty since, and have felt the shattering waves of violence and despair and confusion. I have seen Negro children who really cannot learn, particularly those who in their gelatin plate of babiness have been told that they were inferior. And remembering the Coopers and how we felt about them, I think my main feeling is sorrow at the curtain of fear and anger drawn down between us. And I've just thought of an amusing possibility. If in Salinas, anyone from a wiser and more sophisticated world had asked, quote, how would you like your sister to marry a Cooper? I think we would have laughed. For it might have occurred to us that a Cooper might not have wanted to marry our sister, good friends though we all were. I am going to end on that. And once again, Steinbeck is talking about a subject that is now front and center once again in our country. So pretty much everything he moves through that he thought he was getting to in 1960, 61 has become even more pervasive 60 years later in our same country. And I tell you, when I read through this with people of various ages, everybody is just always amazed at the fact that at how much we're still stuck in the same issues in this country and still going through the same things. It's very interesting. So next week will be our last. That's it. We will finish the book next week. We are right at the point of about 20 pages left. So yeah, it's been a good journey. And the 20th of December will be our last part of the journey.
Excellent, thank you. Does anybody have any final thoughts, comments, questions?
No, it's pretty profound, I think. As you say, we're going through the same thing. Maybe worse.
profound, we're going through the same thing, maybe worse.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, if you picked up this, I mean, it's really amazing that a lot of times the college students, you know, they see it was written in 1960 and they're like, oh, you know, come on, like with reading books, but then they start getting into it and they're like, wow, this is really talking about now, but just from a different perspective in the 60s. And yet what he's saying is so profoundly signaling what's going on today. And Steinbeck just, it's so interesting that this is the only book, you know, it's his wife's favorite book. It's so different from all of his other works. And I think it's his most profound specifically because he's talking about the world he lives in. He's talking about himself. He's inserting himself rather than his huge fictionalized accounts of the Dust Bowl and stuff. So it's a whole nother dimension of a guy who won the Nobel Prize for Literature that we rarely got to see during his life.
Okay, well, thank you. Have a lovely week.
Thank you.
Thanks, thank you.
See you next week.